All right, we're going to pick up and take a look at where blood is made and the process by which it's made. But before I do that, I realize I didn't talk about one thing in the previous lecture, and that is, where are these plasma proteins actually synthesized before they are dumped into the blood? They are synthesized generally in the liver. So the liver, at the very least, synthesizes both of these. And immunoglobulins are produced by white blood cells, or lymphocytes. So those are secreted either directly into the blood or into the lymphatic system. But most plasma proteins are synthesized in the liver, which brings up this very important point. If you have liver failure for whatever reason, then one of the consequences of liver failure would be an inability to make and secrete albumin and fibrinogen. And I want you to think about what those consequences might be. What might be the consequences of not secreting albumin or fibrinogen because of a damaged or failed liver? Kind of interesting, right? Something you'll almost certainly encounter if you go on to have a career in healthcare. So now we're going to take a look at where are all of these cellular elements coming from. So coming back up here, my focus at this point is going to be on the cellular elements. So red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It turns out that all of them are produced by the same multipotent stem cell. That multipotent stem cell is called the hematopoietic stem cell. It's got kind of a funky name. I'll rewrite it. You definitely need to know it, at least recognize it. And the hematopoietic stem cell is a multipotent stem cell. So here's a picture. I know it says pluripotent, but it's multipotent. Here's a picture of a hematopoietic stem cell, and take a look at all the different things it can be. First of all, you'll note that just like almost all stem cells, they start out very generic looking. So they don't have their final look to them yet. They're just kind of this generic cell that looks like a fried egg. So you can see that some daughter cells can go on to be lymphocytes. Remember, I said lymphocyte does not equal leukocyte. And then others go this way here, and you can see different pathways. One pathway leads to a erythrocyte or red blood cell. Another pathway leads to this giant beast of a cell called a megakaryocyte. And megakaryocytes are going to shed little cell fragments and make platelets, and we'll take a look at those later. And then the rest of these are going to differentiate, and that is the term we use, differentiate, into different white blood cells. So these are all the white blood cells. And you can see that all the white blood cells, the megakaryocytes which shed platelets, and erythrocytes all come from the same generic looking stem cell called a hematopoietic stem cell. So hematopoietic stem cell tends to be concentrated in the long bones of adults. So it's in the red bone marrow. So you also need to know that it is found in the red bone marrow, usually of long bones. However, in fetuses, it's found in more places, including the liver, the spleen, and of course the cord blood. So that was something I talked about in a much earlier lecture, the idea of cord blood donations. So let's say that I'm a hematopoietic stem cell and I'm located in the red bone marrow, and the body needs more red blood cells for whatever reason. The body needs more red blood cells. Well, why would the body need more red blood cells? One, let's answer that question. Why would it need more red blood cells? The body was not transporting oxygen well enough. So that would definitely be a trigger that would say, hey, we need more red blood cells. So how does that type of signal get translated to the hematopoietic stem cell? Well, it gets translated either by a hormone or something called a cytokine. But there's some sort of chemical that's going to basically trigger and poke. So we'll do the little pokey thing here. Poke, 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 poke. In fact, I'll go ahead and actually make it poke. poke, 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 poke at that and say, hey, you need to become a red blood cell. Okay, and it's, so what is that thing? Well, it turns out that for red blood cells in particular, there's a hormone that will poke at a hematopoietic stem cell and force it to what's called differentiate. And differentiate means that it is going to slowly morph into a red blood cell. That hormone is called erythropoietin. Now go ahead and write that up. So erythropoietin actually gets an abbreviation. We just love abbreviations. In the second half of this class, we love abbreviation. This one is abbreviated EPO. And so it's a hormone. Now here's an interesting little factoid. EPO is sometimes injected by performance athletes. So athletes that are doing some sort of endurance, long distance running, biking, and so it's used as an illegal doping drug, and sometimes it's referred to as blood doping. So think about what would happen if I injected a bunch of EPO into my body. What is that going to do? Right, it's going to trigger my hematopoietic stem cells to create a bunch of daughter cells, and then they're going to differentiate into red blood cells, and now red blood cells are going to get dumped into my circulation, and they're going to basically run around, and I'm going to have an abnormally elevated number of red blood cells. Well, what is the major function of a red blood cell? Well, the major function of a red blood cell is to transport oxygen. So what's that going to do? By increasing the number of red blood cells, I increase the number of oxygen molecules that I transport in my body, which increases how much oxygen gets delivered to my muscles that are working so hard on this Tour de France race, or, marathon, or whatever it is that I'm doing that requires a lot of endurance. So it increases your red blood cell level usually beyond what you could do just through training. So training, especially like if it's high altitude training, will also induce EPO secretion, and then you'll increase your red blood cell counts. But EPO doping will go above and beyond that cap. And this poses a little bit of a problem, actually. Cheating aside, it poses a physiological problem. And that physiological problem is this. If I increase my red blood cell counts too much, then my blood is going to get kind of sludgy. This is kind of a picture showing red blood cells suspended in solution. And as I mentioned before, red blood cells, of course, are the most common type of cellular element. So let's assume for a moment that I have a normal blood sample. There's my red blood cell. And I'm just going to go ahead and make some copies here. And if I smear this out, it might look something like this. And there might be the occasional white blood cell, and then there's going to be tiny little platelets, but I'm not going to draw those because I only care about the red blood cells here. So maybe the red blood cells make up, 40%, and then the rest of this is all plasma. Red blood cells are like sludge. They're little particles. And so the more red blood cells there are, the more sludgy or viscous my blood gets. So what have we learned about fluids and viscosity? The more viscous the solution, the more resistance there is. So again, imagine if your blood was like maple syrup and you were pumping it around. Your heart would have to work so much harder to try to pump that blood around, and it can cause a bunch of downstream problems, including congestive heart failure. So if somebody's doping, then the number of red blood cells that they create might look more like this. And again, by doping, I mean EPO injections, illicit EPO injections, which can be purchased on the black market. So someone who's been doping on EPO might have red blood cells that look like this. And obviously that's a whole lot more red blood cells. And again, it turns the blood into sludge, increasing the viscosity. So EPO, naturally produced, shouldn't create sludgy blood. But if you inject EPO, you'll override your natural cap and create basically too many red blood cells, and it can lead to downstream problems like early congestive heart failure, can increase the risk of clots. And so a lot of people who kind of overdid it with EPO are now no longer with us because they have died from some consequence of EPO injections. All right, so that basically summarizes how blood cells are made. One more thing I want to talk about before leaving this particular lecture is that I only covered the hormone that is going to trigger red blood cell production. I didn't cover the hormones in any of the others. You are only responsible for knowing the EPO. There are, of course, other triggers, cytokines or hormones, that are going to trigger the production of lymphocytes or eosinophils, basophils, megakaryocytes, and they're not EPO. So that's what I want you to understand. If a hematopoietic stem cell receives a signal from EPO, it knows to divide, and that the daughter cells are going to go through this process here. If instead you want to make more platelets, then you're going to secrete a different hormone that's going to cause the daughter cells to differentiate into megakaryocytes. So under EPO, you expect most or all of the cells to differentiate into red blood cells. All right, in our next lecture, we're going to take a look at the red blood cell in detail and look at what is called the structure-function relationship.